All right, let's dive into World War One. You guys sent in some fascinating sources, one giving us the big picture and another really getting into the personal story. So we'll be exploring not just what happened, but, also why and what it was like for the people who lived through it.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? World War One, it wasn't just some sudden explosion.
More like a slow burn.
Exactly. A pot simmering and slowly reaching that boiling point. The world was edgy. It felt like anything could tip it over.
Not just one event that triggered it then, but a whole bunch of stuff already going on.
Yeah, like our overview says, a whole powder keg of tension just waiting to blow.
Imagine, right? All these countries, each one wanting more power, more land, more resources. They're all suspicious of each other, building up huge armies, stockpiling weapons.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was a climate of fear and distrust, just waiting for a spark.
And then, of course, you've got these alliances all over Europe. Right, and they weren't just words on paper. These were serious promises that could drag a country into a war they didn't even start. One country declares war, and boom, their allies are obligated to jump in too.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly.
So we've got this tense atmosphere, everyone's armed to the teeth, and then bam, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Can you remind our listener who he was and why his death was such a big deal?
So Franz Ferdinand, he was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. That was a big, powerful empire back then. And his assassination in Sarajevo by, well, a Serbian nationalist. That was the match that lit the fuse.
But you're saying it wasn't the only cause of the war, right?
No, it was the spark, sure, but the kindling was already there.
Yeah.
All those tensions were just waiting for an excuse to explode.
So the fuse is lit, World War I begins. Who are the main players on each side?
Okay, so we have two main sides. On one side, the Allied powers. France, Britain, Russia. Later on, Italy and the United States join them. And on the other side, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. So, yeah, it quickly became a global thing.
And what were some of the reasons these different countries decided to join the fight?
Oh, it's complicated, a whole tangle of motivations. Take France, for example. They had a history with Germany, lots of conflict, they wanted to protect their borders, and they definitely didn't want another war.
Makes sense. And Britain, they weren't directly attacked, right? Why did they get involved?
You're right. Britain joined because they were committed to protecting Belgium. Belgium was this small country stuck between France and Germany, and Britain saw their independence as super important for keeping things balanced in the region. If Germany controlled Belgium, it would give them a huge advantage strategically, and that was a no-go for Britain.
It sounds like a high-stakes chess game. What about the Ottoman Empire? Weren't they already in a tough spot before the war even started?
They were. The Ottoman Empire was fading, losing power, desperately trying to hold on to what they had left. Joining the Central Powers was a gamble, a last attempt to stay relevant on the world stage.
So all these global powers, each with their own agendas, collide in World War I. And one of the things that really defines this war is this brutal new way of fighting trench warfare. What was it like for the soldiers stuck in those trenches?
Imagine miles and miles of muddy ditches, rats everywhere. And these trenches became their homes. They lived there, ate there, slept there, all while under constant threat from the enemy.
The mental and physical toll must have been incredible.
Absolutely. To really understand it, I think it helps to look at a specific story. Like Private William James, a young English farmer who signed up when the war broke out. He, like many others, thought it would be a quick, glorious adventure.
And how did that turn out?
Well, his story is a sad one, unfortunately, and one that many soldiers shared. He went from a quiet life on a farm to the brutal reality of the trenches. The fear, the noise, the lack of sleep, the terrible things he saw. And while he talked about the camaraderie, the bonds forged in those horrific conditions, he also saw friends die right next to him.
It's hard to even imagine. And these trenches weren't just random ditches, were they?
No, they were surprisingly complex, with different levels and sections all connected. Frontline trenches, communication trenches, support trenches. And then between the enemy lines, you had no man's land. That was basically a wasteland full of craters and danger where anyone who went out there was exposed to enemy fire.
So how did they attack each other if they were stuck in these trenches?
Well, that's where things get even more tragic. One tactic was called going over the top. Basically, they would charge straight at the enemy trenches across no man's land.
Oh, wow. That sounds terrifying.
It was incredibly dangerous. They were running right into machine guns and artillery fire.
It's amazing to think that amidst all this brutality, there could still be moments of, well, humanity. Our listener sent in a source about Private Jacques Dubois, a French soldier who was part of the Christmas truce of 1916.
Christmas truce, yeah. It's Christmas Eve 1916, and from the German trenches across no man's land came the sound of carols.
It's wild to picture that, enemy soldiers singing Christmas carols to each other in the middle of a war.
It is. And then, slowly, cautiously, soldiers from both sides started to come out of their trenches, meeting in no man's land. They exchanged gifts, sang together, some even played football. They just put the war on hold for a little while.
A powerful reminder that even in the darkest times, we can still connect as humans.
It is. But sadly, the truce didn't last. There was a brief moment of peace in a war that just kept getting more brutal. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the battles, the empires, the millions who died. But I think it's the personal stories like William and Jacques that really make you understand the human cost of this war.
Yeah, those individual experiences. It reminds us that these weren't just soldiers, right? They were sons, husbands, fathers.
Exactly. And many of them, like William, never really left the battlefield, even if they made it home.
Right. He even mentions planting a garden of poppies after the war to remember his friends who died. And speaking of poppies, why did they become such a powerful symbol of remembrance, especially in places like Britain and Canada?
Well, it all goes back to a poem, In Flanders Fields, by John McCrae, a Canadian doctor who served in the war.
Yeah.
Most of the fighting on the Western Front was in Flanders Fields, in Belgium. And amidst all that destruction, these bright red poppies would bloom.
That's beautiful, but also really sad, isn't it? This symbol of life growing in a place associated with so much death.
It is. The poem talks about these poppies growing between rows of white crosses marking the graves. That image, it really stuck with people.
I can see why. It's a reminder of the fragility of life, the sacrifices made, and also the hope for a future without war.
Yeah, exactly. So next time you see a poppy, think of William's Garden, think of Flanders Fields, think of all those who served and died in World War I.
One thing our sources mention is the new technologies used in World War I. Things like machine guns, tanks, even poison gas. How did those change how wars were fought?
World War I was a turning point, for sure. It was this brutal shift from traditional warfare to something much more industrial, much more technologically driven. And these new technologies, yeah, they were advancements in a way, but they also led to way more destruction, way more death.
It's kind of ironic, right? We think of technology as progress, but here it's being used to make war even more deadly.
Yeah, a tragic irony. Take the machine gun, for example. Before World War I, armies mainly used rifles, which were slower and less accurate. But machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, just mowing down enemy troops.
So how did that affect how battles were fought?
Well, it made traditional attacks almost impossible. Charging across open fields became suicide. That's why armies started digging in, building those elaborate trench systems we talked about.
So the machine gun led to the stalemate of trench warfare.
This is a big factor, yeah. And then they developed tanks to try and break that stalemate, to overcome the machine guns.
Those heavily armored vehicles, right? Meant to cross trenches and withstand enemy fire.
That's right. The idea was that tanks would finally break through enemy lines and make offense possible again. But, well, it wasn't that simple.
How so?
Early tanks were slow, clunky, and often broke down, and they were still vulnerable to artillery fire. So while they had potential, they weren't a magic solution.
And then you have poison gas, this terrifying new weapon. Our sources describe just awful effects, injuries, agonizing deaths, and the scramble to develop gas masks.
It was horrific. The Germans were the first to use it in 1915, and it was unlike anything soldiers had ever seen. Imagine this cloud of chlorine gas, heavier than air, just silently spreading across the battlefield, filling the trenches.
I can't imagine the panic during those first gas attacks. The soldiers had no idea what was happening, did they?
Nope. Chlorine gas attacks your respiratory system, causes excruciating pain, burns your eyes and throat, fills your lungs with fluid. It could kill you in minutes if you breathed in enough.
So how did they protect themselves?
At first, they used anything they could find. Cloths soaked in urine, anything they thought might filter the air. It was desperate, and it didn't really work.
Oh, wow.
It shows you the kind of desperation they were facing. And then gas masks were developed. They were crude and uncomfortable at first, but at least they offered some protection against this invisible, deadly threat.
So with all these new weapons being developed, it sounds like World War I became this terrifying arms race.
It did. Each side was constantly trying to outdo the other, to invent some new weapon or tactic that would give them an advantage. And sadly, it was the soldiers on the front lines who paid the price for this progress.
It's crazy to think about how huge this conflict was. Millions of soldiers from all over the world caught in this maelstrom. And like you said earlier, it wasn't just limited to Europe.
Yeah, World War I was a global war with fighting in Africa, the Middle East, Asia. The Ottoman Empire, even though they were weakening, still controlled some key territory.
Like the Dardanelles Strait, I've heard that was important.
Crucial. It's a narrow waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Control the Dardanelles, and you control access to Russia, one of the Allied powers.
So if the Allies could take the Dardanelles, they could get supplies to Russia and maybe even knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. Is that why they launched the Gallipoli campaign?
Exactly. But it was a disaster.
What happened?
Bad planning, logistical issues, and strong resistance from the Ottomans. It dragged on for almost a year, with huge losses on both sides. The Allies eventually had to withdraw.
So it was a military defeat and a huge loss of life.
A tragic chapter in a war already filled with tragedy. And it shows that even when there's a clear strategic objective, the human cost can be immense.
You know, with all this talk about battles and technology, it's important to remember the human side of things. We've talked about William James, the farmer, and Jacques Dubois, who was part of that Christmas truce. Their stories, even though they're just two individuals, they really represent what so many soldiers went through in World War I.
Yeah, they do. It's a reminder that history is made up of people's lives, their individual stories, their triumphs and tragedies.
And it's amazing how those stories still resonate today, even though the war ended over 100 years ago. It makes you think about the lasting impact of war, not just on the soldiers, but on whole societies.
Absolutely. World War I had consequences that lasted for generations. It wasn't just about who won or lost. It reshaped Europe, led to the collapse of empires, and even planted the seeds for future conflicts.
And speaking of reshaping Europe, one of the big outcomes of the war was the Treaty of Versailles. You mentioned earlier that it was controversial. Why is that?
Well, the Treaty of Versailles was the agreement that officially ended the war in 1919. But instead of bringing peace and healing, a lot of people argue that it actually set the stage for more conflict down the road, because the treaty was really harsh on Germany.
In what way?
Well, first of all, Germany had to take full blame for the war, which was a tough pill to swallow. Then they had to pay these huge reparations to the Allies for all the damage that was done. And on top of that, they had to shrink their military and give up land.
Wow, that does sound harsh.
It was. And a lot of historians believe that all that resentment and economic hardship, it contributed to the rise of extremism in Germany, which eventually played a part in the outbreak of World War II.
It's a reminder that peace treaties, if they're not done right, can actually cause more problems.
Exactly. And the impact of World War I went beyond just politics and borders. It really changed the social fabric of a lot of countries. Well, think about all the young men who were killed or wounded. That loss had a huge effect on families and communities all over Europe. And then there were the psychological scars. So many soldiers came home with what we now call PTSD.
It's hard to imagine the collective trauma a whole generation must have gone through.
It was huge. And women who had taken on new roles during the war, they started demanding more rights, more equality. The war had disrupted the old ways of doing things, and there was no going back.
So in a way, World War I led to some positive social changes as well.
Definitely. It sped up the women's suffrage movement, challenged traditional gender roles, and made people rethink their ideas about society, power, even the nature of war itself.
It's amazing to think how one conflict could have so many far-reaching consequences.
World War I was a turning point in history. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of a new one, full of uncertainty, but also full of possibilities.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've explored all the complex events that led to World War I, the clash of empires, the different motivations countries had, and the terrifying new ways of fighting. But I think the most important thing we've done is hear the stories of individuals like William and Jacques. Those stories remind us of the true cost of war, the human cost.
Yeah, their experiences, the sacrifices they made, their resilience. Those are the things we need to remember when we study history. They remind us that behind every date, every battle, every political decision, there are real people whose lives are affected.
We started out wanting to understand not just what happened in World War I, but why it happened and what it was like for those who lived through it. And I think we've done that.
We've looked at the political maneuvering, the new technologies, the social and cultural changes that shaped the war and what came after.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The echoes of World War I are still with us today. in the way countries interact with each other, in the balance of global power, even in the conflicts we see happening in the 21st century. It reminds us that history isn't just something we read about in books. It shapes who we are and the world we live in.
So as you continue learning about the past, about wars and conflicts, always try to find those personal stories, those human voices that tell us what war really costs. Because in those stories, we find the lessons, the warnings, and maybe even the inspiration to build a future where conflicts like World War I are just a memory, a chapter in the history books.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today. We've got some fascinating excerpts about this Canadian nurse.
Well, this is going to be good.
Alice Thompson, World War I. And get this, she actually disguised herself as a man to serve on the front lines.
I know. I mean, talk about a story, right?
So let's start with just who Alice was. What can we piece together from these excerpts?
Well, it seems she was about 25 when the war broke out, already a trained nurse, and clearly, I mean, you can see it in the sources, deeply affected by what the soldiers were going through, driven to help.
It's interesting because it really gives you a sense of the times, right? I mean, 1914, that's not that long after the Victorian era. Women's roles were so different.
Exactly. And yet here she is, right in the thick of it. The sources really highlight the conditions in these field hospitals, just horrific. Overcrowded, constantly under threat, supplies were so limited.
Yeah, one of the excerpts mentions they were practically running out of anesthesia and antibiotics. I mean, can you imagine trying to treat these horrific injuries with basically nothing?
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how much we take for granted today.
Absolutely. But, okay, so Alice is working in these awful conditions. And then there's this turning point. She overhears some soldiers talking about a dangerous mission.
Right, and it's like a switch flips in her head. It's not enough to just patch them up anymore. She has to protect them.
And that's when she decides to, basically sneak off and join them?
Pretty much. Cuts her hair, takes the name Allen, puts on a uniform, and blends right in with a unit heading to the front lines.
Bold move. I mean, wouldn't her absence from the hospital put other soldiers at risk? Wasn't there an ethical dilemma there?
It's a good question, right? It really shows how complex her decision was. I mean, on one hand, she's abandoning her post, but on the other, she's driven by this intense need to protect these men in a way that goes beyond just medicine.
Wow. So she's on the battlefield now, and from what I'm seeing in these excerpts, Allen is not exactly taking it easy.
Oh, not at all. Hauling equipment, digging trenches, delivering messages while under fire. There's even an account of her rescuing a trapped soldier after a bombing.
Talk about bravery. She's risking her life over and over again. But eventually her secret comes out.
A gas attack. It was a terrifying new weapon at the time. Alice gets injured, and her true identity is revealed.
I'd imagine her superiors weren't too happy about this whole charade.
It's interesting, actually. The sources say they were shocked, of course, but also impressed by her courage. They recognized that what she did was extraordinary, even if it was against the rules.
It makes you wonder about the culture of the military back then, right?
Yeah.
This mix of rigid rules and then this grudging respect for someone who breaks them but does something truly heroic.
Yeah, there's a red tension there.
And her story doesn't end there. After the war, Alice becomes a vocal advocate for women's rights.
Exactly. The sources mention her pushing for better recognition of women's roles in the war effort. Not just nurses, but all the women on the home front, too. She also fought for better working conditions for nurses and challenged those societal expectations that were holding women back.
Did she face any pushback for speaking out like that?
Some, for sure. The excerpts mention some traditionalists who weren't happy. But overall, her story really resonated with people, especially those who had seen the war firsthand.
I can imagine. She even wrote a book about her experiences, right?
That's right. And through her speaking engagements and her book, her message really started to spread.
It's pretty incredible. I mean, thinking about Alice's story today, what do you think is the most important takeaway for us? What barriers do we still face? And what can we learn from her about breaking them down?
Well, to me, Alice's story is about the power of individual action, even when facing enormous challenges. She saw something wrong, something unjust, and she acted on it, even if it meant risking everything.
And she didn't stop there. She used her experience to fight for a better future, for herself and for other women.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we all have the potential to challenge norms, to push for change, to make a difference, just like Alice did.
Wow. Well, that's Alice Thompson. A truly remarkable story and great reminder to all of us to, maybe get out there and challenge the status quo a little bit.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.